Hi there, I'm Dr. Nate Story with Bright Agrotech, and this is Aquaponics Academy, episode number 14. Today we're going to discuss the nitrogen cycle.
Welcome to Aquaponics Academy, a Bright Agrotech podcast designed to help you overcome common aquaponic issues, learn new growing techniques, and help you be as successful as you can be as an aquaponic practitioner. Whether you're just getting started or you've been growing aquaponically for decades, this podcast is for anyone wanting to design the best performing system possible. Join aquaponics expert Dr. Nate Story, the creator of Zip Grow Towers, as he breaks down complex topics into easy-to-understand information. And now, here's Dr. Nate Story.
Today we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle, but we're going to try and talk about it in a way that's simple and understandable. Before we get started, I want to remind you that reviews are really important to expanding the reach of this podcast. So, if you're listening to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, please do us a favor and leave a nice review. So jumping right into this. Nitrogen exists in systems in a couple different forms, but the main ones, of course, are as a gas and in the form of solids. So when we talk about nitrogen solids, we're talking about fish waste products, okay? And we're talking about dead organisms, whether it's algae, whether it's plants, whether it's some other organism within our system that's dead, that's decaying, that's releasing nitrogen in some way. Either through decomposition or through just the regular metabolism. But I'll explain all of that a little bit later. Nitrogen is a really, really important element to plants and animals, and in aquaponic systems, microbes as well. So the thing to understand is that oftentimes the productivity of our aquaponic systems are directly related to the availability of nitrogen. Now, we'll see a lot of other nutrient deficiencies in systems, but nitrogen is the most common element that causes problems in these systems. Either too much of one form, specifically nitrites or ammonia, or too little of other forms, namely nitrates. So, let's dig right into this. Nitrogen exists in aquaponic systems in a lot of different forms, but it comes into the aquaponic system as a protein, almost always as a protein. So there aren't very many nitrogen-fixing plants or organisms in aquaponic systems that we've discovered. We know that most of that nitrogen is coming in the form of protein. And almost all of that is coming in the form of fish food. So you'll notice that systems with higher protein content in the fish food, and depending on the species of fish that's being cultured, of course, times runs a little bit higher nitrates, or generates more nitrates per pound of feed that's put into the system. Feed with lower nitrogen content in the form of protein generates less. So we can basically influence how much nitrogen is in our system or is going into our system by manipulating the amount of feed that we're feeding and the amount of protein in our fish feed. So, just walking you guys through how the different microbial processes go in the system, because almost all of the processes with nitrogen are mediated by microbes. That means that all of the processes microbes perform. So, pretty much everything that happens to nitrogen in the system, a microbe of some type, this is a bacteria usually, is doing the work. So, something to think about. So nitrogen comes in the form of protein. And proteins are, of course, organic molecules, but they've got nitrogen kind of at the core of them. Nitrogen is central to protein molecules. Proteins are made up of smaller little snippets called amino acids. So protein goes into the system and the fish eats the food, right? So the fish is yum, munching on all this high protein feed, and it's eating some of it. Some of that's going into its gut, some of it's not. And some of it's just passing right through its gut, right? So we've got protein that the fish goes down into the fish's gut, and all of these microbes in the gut. Again, this is totally a microbially mediated process. All of those proteins are digested in the fish's gut, and the fish made available for the fish to absorb, right? So broken down usually into amino acids, which the fish can absorb and use in its body. Similarly, a lot of these proteins are passed, are pooped out by the fish, and they just enter as organic solids into the system. So once all of these solids are in the system, of course, microbes do pretty much the same thing that happens in the fish's gut. They break these solids down and they release nitrogen. So one of the first steps is breaking it down into amino acids. These are easy to think of as just little snippets that these are little or itty bitty organic molecules that also have nitrogen in them. So proteins break down into amino acids, and then these amino acids are broken down by microbes into ammonia, usually ammonia or ammonium, depending on pH and depending on the process. So going back to protein, we have the microbial metabolism of these proteins, and then we also have the fish. Okay, so the fish are actually generating ammonia as well, ammonium, and they're doing this by breaking down those proteins, breaking down those amino acids, using them for energy. And in the process, ammonia or ammonia is created. So in land animals, we're able to take this dangerous stuff, this ammonia, and we're able to turn it into urea, okay, which is a charged molecule. It's easy to control because it has a charge. But ammonia, as it is, doesn't have a charge. In fish, this isn't a big deal because that ammonia just kind of diffuses across the cell membranes and diffuses out into the water, because usually where these fish live, there just isn't a whole lot of ammonia in the water. So it likes to go from a high gradient to a low gradient, so a place of high concentration across that gradient to a place of low concentration. So it's moving through the fish out into the water. Well, this is where the danger begins for us, right? And we'll get into this a little bit deeper a little bit later. But if there's a lot of ammonia out in the environment, then sometimes it likes to reverse. It likes to go in reverse. It likes to go into the fish, or the fish can't get rid of the ammonia fast enough. And ammonia is pretty darn poisonous for these reasons. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So all of these processes are performed by bacteria. Bacteria are at the core of the entire system. So in aquaponic systems, everyone likes to talk about fish. Everyone likes to talk about plants. But really what people should be talking about even more is bacteria. And how do we keep those bacteria happy? So most of the problems with systems, of course, are bacterial. They're not necessarily fish problems. They're not necessarily plant problems. They're bacterial problems. We just don't know what they are because we can't really see bacteria. And that entire ecosystem, that little microbial ecosystem, is pretty darn mysterious. We just don't really know what's going on there. And that's just kind of the way it is, and I anticipate that's the way it's going to be for some time. But it's important to remember that microbes perform all of the work when it comes to processing this nitrogen. So before we even talk about that, it's important to talk about biological surface area. And if you haven't watched the YouTube video on that, I would highly recommend the video on biological surface area. This is basically habitat for our bacteria. We're giving them a place to live. If the bacteria don't have a place to live, then they can't do work. So we need to make sure that there's lots of habitat for our bacteria. The other thing to remember is that CO2 is one of the key ingredients in nitrification. So it's one of the key ingredients in this process. So most people don't know this, but bacteria are actually fixing carbon. Okay, so they're consuming the nitrogen. Well, they're not consuming the nitrogen. They're oxidizing these different compounds, and they're using that to make energy. And then they use that energy to fix carbon so that they can grow and reproduce and do what they do. So having a system with good dissolved CO2 and lots of CO2 in the environment is an important part of nitrification as well. Similarly, all of the reactions that happen that we want are aerobic. That means they happen in the presence of oxygen. So for really efficient nitrification, we need to make sure that our system has a lot of dissolved oxygen. Our system solution, lots of dissolved oxygen, good diffusion of oxygen in the atmosphere into our solution, and that our microbes have lots of oxygen to work with, because it's very difficult to oxidize nitrogen if there's no oxygen in the environment. So the first step here is ammonia, ammonium. And the first thing to do is, if you haven't watched the video on ammonia or ammonium, please do, because I talk about that in a little bit more detail And I talk about the difference between the two and how pH affects the prevalence of one form over the other. But ammonia is usually what we talk about, especially in especially in most aquaponic systems. And ammonia is uncharged. That means it has no charge to it. And that's a really bad thing because it means it can move across cell membranes, which means it can poison our fish, which means it at high levels it can even damage our plants. And it's a bad deal. That's one of the reasons why ammonium is preferable. Ammonium has a charge. It has a single positive charge to it. What that means is that we can kind of control where it goes, and the plants can control whether or not it comes into the plant or doesn't come into the plant. Similarly, the fish can control whether it can move across their membranes or whether it can't. So we like ammonium because it's charged. It's easy to exclude from our cells, but ammonia is not. It just moves right in, and for that reason, it's a poisonous compound. Or it's a dangerous compound because it is poisonous and it can move across those membranes. So on fish, ammonia has a toxic effect, right? Fish really cannot tolerate very much. Most fish species are really stressed around 2 parts per million ammonia, and most fish start to croak around 5 parts per million. Now, they can kind of build up a little stress tolerance in regards to ammonia, but you really can't run above 5 with almost any cultured fish species without killing them. So it's definitely something to think about, something to remember. Ammonia is nasty stuff, and we don't want it in our system any more than we have to have it. And so it's poisonous to our fish. Now, it's also at high levels poisonous to our plants. Now, I will tell you, in most aquaponic systems, you're not going to be having toxic levels of ammonia without seeing lots of fish death. So if your plants are still, if your fish are still alive, then you're probably not at levels that are toxic to your fish. But it's important to note that ammonium specifically is taken up by plants, okay, and it's used by plants. It can be in very small amounts, but what it does is it causes the plant to develop a little bit differently than other forms of nitrogen, specifically nitrate. So in systems where you have a lot more ammonia or ammonium, you'll see your plants, they get a little bit leggier. They're not as stout, they're not as compact, they leg out a little bit, which isn't really a good thing most of the time. So that's something to keep in mind. We want to limit the amount of ammonia in our system. The process of changing ammonia into nitrite, okay, this is an oxidation reaction. We take ammonia and we basically slap some oxygen and oxygen onto it, and this is called an oxidation reaction. So this is performed by a bacteria, specifically a bacteria called Nitrosomonas. And for that reason, this process is often called nitrosification. So you'll hear it referred to as nitrosification because one of the primary bacterial groups involved is the Nitrosomonas bacteria. So these bacteria, they take ammonia, and in the presence of oxygen, they oxidize it into nitrite. Okay, and they oxidize it into nitrite in the presence of oxygen, and this is a good deal. We take this toxic stuff and we turn it into nitrite. So nitrosification is this process of taking ammonia and oxidizing it into nitrite. Nitrite has the chemical formula NO2, and it has a negative charge. So again, we have a charged molecule. The thing to remember is that nitrite is also really, really poisonous. Okay, so we're not necessarily ending up with a less poisonous product by the time we're done converting. In fact, nitrite is even more poisonous to fish than ammonia. So we can't really deal with very high levels of nitrite without seeing a lot of fish stress, without seeing a lot of problems that we really want to avoid. And it's also pretty darn poisonous to plants. So the goal here is to develop really good, strong nitrification cycles where our ammonia is oxidized very quickly, and then our nitrite is oxidized very quickly as well. Nitrite, fortunately, in most systems, is it's an intermediary kind of thing that gets processed really quickly once you've got good nitrification. So in turn, nitrite is oxidized into nitrate. And this is a really fast process usually. And this is performed by some other bacteria. Nitrobacter is one of the main ones that's commonly kind of identified as one of the groups that does this. And what they do is they take nitrite and they slap some oxygen onto it and give us nitrate, which is NO3 with a negative charge. Nitrate is wonderful stuff. It's what our plants use. It's non-toxic to fish, relatively non-toxic, and it's really kind of the end product that we're looking for. So Nitrobacter kind of bring us the rest of the way there. It starts with nitrous ammonius, oxidizing that ammonia or ammonium. And then we have Nitrobacter that oxidizes that nitrite into nitrate. And nitrate is what we want out of the entire process. So the big things to remember are that all of this are microbial processes. So these are all done by microbes. They're all consuming oxygen in the process. So unless you have a lot of oxygen, you can't have efficient nitrification. And in this process, interestingly enough, a lot of hydronium ions are released. So we're taking NH4, we're putting oxygen on it, and that's ammonium, okay? And we end up with nitrite and 4 hydronium ions. That's a lot. We're acidifying our water. And for those of you who remember what acidification is, it's just the number of hydronium ions in our solution. They impact our acidity, essentially. So as this process goes, we're acidifying our solution. So our system is becoming more and more acidic as the nitrification process happens. Similarly, when nitrite is oxidized into nitrate, we release another 2 to 3 hydronium ions. Okay, so there's more hydronium ions released in that process too. So we end up with really quite a bit of acidification for every ammonia or ammonia molecule that is oxidized. And this is why systems without a lot of carbonates in them tend to become more and more acidic over time. So that's a really good point to remember. And it's important to know how much of that is happening in your system, because what it means is that all of this ammonia being released by your fish just in the process of respiration, the ammonia being released through the decomposition of organic compounds and organic solids, all of that ammonia ends up resulting in an acidified system once it's all been processed. So sometimes feeding your fish more, moving your nitrification cycle along is the most effective way to bring your pH in your system down. And that's why we always say don't add acid, just get your nitrification cycle online and running and try to outstrip all of the carbonates coming in your solution. So this is kind of a little bit technical, and I'm hoping that this isn't being overcomplicated. But the goal of all of this is to remember microbes do all of the work. You know, the magic number with ammonia is try to never let it crack 2 parts per million. The magic number with nitrite is never let it crack 1 part per million, and preferably below half a part per million. And, of course, nitrates then, the wonderful, wonderful nitrates, totally non-toxic to fish, totally non-toxic to plants, except at really, really high levels, are, these great compounds that plants can use. And this is what we're shooting for. And we can go up to around 160 parts per million, usually, with nitrate before we start seeing any ill effects on the fish. So, nitrates, above that level can kind of interfere with the ability of your, the ability of, fish to fix oxygen. So like when they're trying to breathe, when they're trying to, attach, I don't think it's hemoglobin, but when they're trying to attach that oxygen to, in their blood, to fix that oxygen, to transport it through their blood to their muscles and to their brain and to their organs, too much nitrate interferes with that. process. And so you start to end up with lethargic fish. They look a little bit sleepy, a little bit sad. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're up around, 160, 180, 200 parts per million nitrate, then I'd start getting a little bit concerned. But up until about 160 parts per million, you should be all right. Now, whether you want to run your nitrates that high for your plants is another question, because one thing that comes with nitrates with a vengeance oftentimes is aphid problems. Aphids love, for whatever reason, I don't know why, they really love really high nitrate systems. And when your plants are taking up lots of nitrates, I have noticed that aphid issues tend to be more pronounced. But that's totally a side note. We won't get into that too much. So there you have it. You've got the entire cycle. We have protein coming in. The fish take up nitrogen in the form of amino acids, proteins. They're digesting it. They're using it in their bodies, incorporating it into their muscles through respiration, through the process of them essentially breathing. They're releasing ammonia out into the environment through their urine, through their poop. They're releasing these compounds, and in our system itself, we have all of these solids breaking down. We have all of these. Well, actually, I should say I don't think fish urinate, so I guess they don't have pee. But in all of the fish. In all of that fish poop, we have this nitrogen that's going out into our system, that's breaking down and being turned into ammonia through microbial processes, being oxidized to nitrite through microbial processes, being oxidized to nitrate through microbial processes. And once it's nitrate, our plants can start to take it up. So they can start to take up that nitrogen, and they can really start to use it in significant quantities, more significant than, say, ammonium in our system. So this is what really helps our plants to grow. And people oftentimes ask, how do we lose nitrogen? Well, what about denitrification, that kind of thing? Denitrification is not common in aquaponic systems. And if you are experiencing denitrification, that's the process of taking nitrate nitrogen and turning it into a gas, reducing it, and turning it into nitrogen gas. If you have that happening in your system, you've got big problems, mostly anaerobic conditions somewhere in your system that's going to be causing you some pain. So if that's the case, definitely be paying a lot of attention to your system. Make sure that you don't have organic solids building up somewhere. Make sure you don't have too much decomposition in the system. So that's the very simple nitrogen cycle right there. Encapsulated proteins to amino acids to ammonia, ammonium, to nitrite, uptaken by plants, and then it leaves the system. But that's not entirely a fair way to talk about nitrogen in our system, because there's all sorts of little intermediate cycles that take place between the protein going in and the proteins coming out in the form of plants, right? So this is basically when algae or when microinvertebrates like worms are consuming that algae or other organisms in the system, microbes, are taking up nitrogen or are assimilating nitrogen for their own growth and development. So, say algae, it's consuming nitrogen in our system. It goes through a life growth cycle, and then it dies, and then a worm eats it. Well, the worm is eating the proteins that the algae created from nitrate in our system, or from ammonia in our system. And the worm eats that protein, and then it incorporates it into its body, and then it dies, or it has babies, or whatever. And so you see we have all of these kind of little smaller nutrient cycles within the main system, probably way more than we could ever peg down. It's a really, really complex biology. So that's something to note, because what it means is in some systems, when you're adding nitrogen to the system, you have a lag between adding the nitrogen, and it corresponds directly with system establishment and maturity. But that lag essentially is the process of not just your plants taking up that nitrogen, but also kind of all of these little intermediary cycles taking off. So it's something to think about, something to remember. And the more little miniature cycles you have in your system, it forms a kind of nitrogen buffer, if you will, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it also kind of reduces the amount of control you have over nitrogen in your system. So, I mean, you can stop feeding, and even though your plants are still actively taking up nitrogen, you still see kind of nitrogen bleeding into your system over time from these little dying organisms and from this cycle and that cycle as they leak nitrogen back out into the system. So it's something to keep in mind, and it's something to look out for, and a lot of the times it can explain really weird things in your system. So it's good to know about, and it's good to think about. So how does nitrogen leave our system? Now, the most obvious way is through plants. So when we harvest our plants, nitrogen is leaving our system. But it's also important to remember that we lose nitrogen when we lose water, right? If you're doing a water change, you're losing a lot of nitrogen that you've invested money and time in. So we want to minimize water changes. We want to minimize leaks. We want to minimize exploded pipes. We want to minimize anything where we're losing water. Not just because we value water, but because we value the nitrogen and the other nutrients in that water. We can lose it through denitrification. Again, this isn't super common, but in some systems that are poorly designed, poorly planned, we have anaerobic conditions somewhere, and what's happening is these, again, bacteria are taking nitrogen in our system. They're reducing it, and turning into gas. And that represents a big waste of money if it's happening. So we want to avoid denitrification by minimizing the number of anaerobic zones in our system. And then, of course, the harvest of fish and the harvest of plants. So when we take plants out of our system, we're taking out, basically the product of all of those nitrates. We're taking out plants that have proteins and nitrates, even, soluble nitrate, and they're dissolved in their cytoplasm, dissolved in their cells. It's being moved around. It's being turned into amino acids and proteins. It's being metabolized and worked with inside the plant. So we're removing that nitrogen when we remove the plants. Similarly, when we take fish out, we're also removing a lot of nitrogen in the form of protein. So when we take out that fish, that's where most of our protein is going, is into fish biomass. So when we remove some of that biomass, we're removing protein from the system. There is kind of a mass balance here, and we want to shoot for nitrogen efficiency in our system. So this is something to think about as you're thinking about the nitrogen going in and the nitrogen coming out. Nitrogen efficiency is just basically minimizing the amount of nitrogen that we lose from our system in a non-productive way. So a productive way is, of course, taking fish out and selling fish, making money from the fish, buying more fish food, and that's sustainable, right? Similarly, taking out plants, using those plants, eating those plants, selling those plants, that's all a really good use of nitrogen. Denitrification is a bad use of nitrogen, or the loss to other organisms that are unusable. Whether that's crops that fail and we have to throw away, whether it's water losses, whether it's dead fish, loss of fish. This all impacts our nitrogen efficiency. So we want to shoot for a system that is designed well and designed to minimize the loss of nitrogen from our system, because we're paying money for every molecule of organic nitrogen that goes in there. So the last thing I want to talk about is how to manage nitrogen in your system. We've already talked about designing a system so that the nitrogen is conserved, so that we have efficiency. But a lot of people don't realize that they can manage the nitrogen in their system. So these are things, little tips. One of the favorite things I love to tell people that no one seems to think about too much is, in smaller systems, if you have a single fish die, stop feeding for at least a day, if not 2 days. Because you have a little flush of ammonia right after that fish dies as it begins to decompose, that first little flush. So this is a management thing, right? If we feed right on top of a dead fish, on top of an ammonia flush, we bump up our ammonia even higher, especially when we don't have strong nitrification. And it's a kind of a cascading effect, and we can wipe out our whole system in no time flat if we're not paying attention, we're not watching the fish feeding, because the fish are not going to feed when they're ammonia stressed. So it's a negative feedback loop. The fish get stressed because of the ammonia. They stop feeding. You feed them anyways. More ammonia enters the system. The fish die, right? So pay attention. There are cultural things like that where you want to be paying attention to your fish, to their behavior. You want to be testing ammonia very regularly unless you have a strong, established system and you know exactly how it works. At our greenhouse, as much as I tell folks to test ammonia regularly, they don't really. And to be perfectly fair, we very seldom have ammonia above a quarter of a part per million or half a part per million. Our system just eats it up really quickly. But when bad things happen, when something disturbs the system, it's good to take tests, and it's good to really watch your feeding immediately after. Managing the nitrogen in your system means not just managing it in a way that's beneficial to your system, to your plants, and to your fish from a productivity standpoint, but is also beneficial to your system from a losses standpoint. So you want to minimize the losses, and you don't want any compounding effects from doing something boneheaded after you have a fish die off or something like that. So other ways we can manage nitrogen, of course, with temperature, remembering that all of our microbial processes are responsible for oxidizing ammonia, oxidizing nitrite, breaking down organic solids into ammonia. We can change the temperature and change the rate at which that process happens. So warmer waters speed those processes up, cooler waters slow those processes down. So we can use temperature to kind of manipulate some of those processes. Providing enough BSA. We talk about this all the time with matrix media and zip grow towers. How are you making sure that you have enough BSA in your system? And if you have any questions about that, watch the YouTube video we did a while back on calculating BSA from specific surface area values and making sure that you have enough in your system to take care of the fish that you're stocking. Another thing is to kind of govern intermediate cycles. So a lot of people introduce things like duckweed, introduce things like crayfish and other organisms to their system. What they're introducing is intermediate cycles, where nitrogen is being taken up, it's being consumed, it's being used in the life cycle of these other organisms. And that's all well and good, but what it does is it does relinquish a little bit of controls. Sometimes it introduces more stability, but it does relinquish some control. So think about those before you just throw duckweed in your system. Make sure that you want to live with the consequences. The easiest way to manipulate nitrogen in our system is through our inputs. So feeding higher protein feed when you want to see more nitrate, feeding lower protein feed when you want to see less. And it's really about ratios to other plant nutrients. But at the same time, being able to increase or lower the amount of nitrogen going into our system just with protein content in feed is a really useful tool. And the one caution I would say there is that a lot of you've probably heard me rant about this before, but a lot of fish feeds incorporate non-digestible protein. And what that means is they blow their protein numbers up by adding stuff that isn't digestible for your fish, or really for your microbes even in the short term. So these are things like feather meal, right? I hate feather meal, and everyone I talk to about fish feed knows that I rant about feather meal. It's just, all it does is add sludge to your system. And it's miserable stuff, but people add it because it blows up their protein numbers on their feed. So it makes it look like it has higher protein than it really does. There are some good soy-based fish feeds out there with good protein contents, but you really, in my opinion, cannot beat fish meal protein. So protein from fish meal. It's super digestible. It breaks down really quickly. It's high protein. You're not going to have as many sludge issues associated with it. There are questions about its sustainability, and very good questions about its sustainability. Questions I don't want to just dismiss lightly. But if you're just looking for efficiency in your system, nothing in the world beats fish meal or fish meal-based feeds. So to that end, keep in mind the kind of feeds that you're using in your system and the protein contents of those feeds, and use them according to the desired result. You'll get a feel for your system and how it takes in protein and what it kicks out, how fast it moves, how fast your nitrification cycles move, et cetera, et cetera. So that's about it for today. We talked about nitrogen, how it comes in. As a gas, it's existing as nitrogen gas in our atmosphere, and in some really bad systems, it's leaving the system as a gas. That's not too common. Most of the time, we're dealing with solid nitrogen. This is nitrogen in organic solids, and what this means is that these things need to be broken down. It breaks down into ammonia, which is oxidized to nitrite, which is oxidized to nitrate. Our system is acidified in the process. Oxygen is consumed in that process. Again, touching on the importance of oxygen. Make sure you have enough. Make sure you have enough to supply your nitrification cycle, and make sure you don't crash your oxygen, your dissolved oxygen, by running your nitrification cycle too fast. But anyways, that nitrification cycle takes ammonium, and microbes oxidize it to nitrite, and microbes oxidize that to nitrate, and then the plants take that nitrate up and use it, and we get a crop. It leaves in the form of fish and in the form of plants most often, and we can manipulate how it functions in our system. We can manipulate the efficiency of our system through a variety of different methods. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Aquaponics Academy. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to download the next episode where we're going to talk. Honestly, I can't even remember what we're talking about in the next episode. I'm sure it'll be great. Oh, Chris is going to kill me. If you're a regular listener, you know that with every Aquaponics Academy episode, we like to help you guys learn new techniques, gain new knowledge about aquaponics, hopefully do it in a way that is comprehensible and not frustrating for you. And I know this was kind of a technical episode. Hopefully it wasn't too technical. Hopefully it gives you, kind of skims the surface here and gives you enough knowledge to kind of know what's going on when you see this happening in your system. Know what's going on when you're having this nitrification problem. Hopefully this episode was useful to you in that regard. Anyways, we introduce a lot of people to clear, demystified, very valuable resources for beginners, for advanced growers, for everyone along the spectrum. You guys can find those over at our website, brightegrotech.com. And if you find these podcasts valuable, leave a tip on our podcast website, or help us to continue producing these episodes. They take time, they take a little bit of preparation, and of course, anything to help us keep them going is certainly appreciated. If you're not a Bright Agrotech customer yet, we'd encourage you to check out our product line over on zipgrow.com. We got a lot of great stuff over there. Been working on it for a lot of years. And we'll look forward to catching you next time for another episode of Aquaponics Academy. Thanks so much for listening.